First and foremost, Kal Halal Yahweh, Bahashem Yahweh Shai, Bahashem Kodash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone who taught me this truth and who still lead as examples to the flock. Peace and salutations to the Akim out there pushing this word, sincerity and truth. Salutations also to the rest of the believers, men, women, and children, waiting for the deliverance. The devil is at it again, pushing forth his agenda, and as a watchman of the Heavenly Father, our job is to pay attention to the developments on the global stage in the news and match them back to biblical prophecy. This is Ecclesiasticus chapter 39 and verse 1. But he that giveth his mind to the law of the Most High and is occupied in the meditation thereof will seek out the wisdom of the ancient and be occupied in prophecies. And that's our job. And as watchmen, as prophets, our job is to seek out the wisdom of the ancient. And we do that by going through these scriptures, eating this rule, and be occupied in prophecies. Because if we're not occupied in prophecies, then we can't see the things that are happening and we can't watch and tell and warn, which is the fundamental job of a watchman, to warn. Right? So the latest news that I'm talking about is a part of the King, what is his name? King Charles speech, you know. So this was posted today, in the Sun, right, which is a UK, news outlet. And it says controversial digital IDs won't be mandatory, Charles confirms in King's speech. Now, if you remember, a few months ago, several months ago, the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer introduced the digital ID as a mandatory implementation that would start December of this year, I believe. And there was significant pushback to the point where they had to cancel it. And no, lo and behold, it's back. Right? It says the controversial digital ID scheme won't be mandatory, King Charles confirmed in his speech. Right? So what he's saying is that no, it has been confirmed that the public will have an option to use the scheme as part of Digital Access to Services Bill. So it says what? Digital Access to Services. That's important to know. So it's going to be voluntary. It announced that it will be free to use for anyone who wishes to use it, right? So Digital Access to Services Bill. First, it's going to be voluntary. But will it remain voluntary? That's what we're going to explore, right? It says ministers launched a consultation on digital ID in March, which would allow people to prove they are online, right, in one safe place at the touch of a button. Because what they want to do is they want to be able to track your activity online, to connect your online activity to who you are, a real person, right? The digital ID can be used for things like free childcare vouchers, right? Tax, passport, driver's license, replacing piles of paperwork and repeated checks, right? So so I wanted to plug this into my friendly robot, right here. Let's get it back. Seeing. So it says, go to the top of the chat. So I put the link to the article and it says, what tactic is being used here? The UK reintroduced the digital ID as voluntary following pushback from its mandatory declaration from a year ago, right? And this is important. The reason why we bring out these things is because it's important to know the schemes, of the devil. Second Corinthians 2 verse 11, lest Satan should get an advantage of us, for we are not ignorant of his devices, of his schemes, of his plans, And what are these plans, right? It says the tactic you are identifying is often referred to as a strategic increase or what? Incrementalism. All right, let's look at what that word means. Right? Incrementalism, right? It says belief in or advocacy of changes by degrees, gradualism, right? So you take your time and you incrementally, right, change things instead of one massive change. Because when you say mandatory, that immediately triggers a defense mechanism in people's mind, especially when it's something that has to do with their data and their privacy. You're gonna have natural pushback, right? So what's happening is, it says, in the context of the UK public policy and a specific reporting in the Sun, the government is moving from a hard mandate, which sparked significant backlash, to a soft voluntary rollout. This shift involves several specific psychological and political tactics, the foot in the door technique. By making the ID voluntarily, the government lowers the barrier to entry and reduces immediate resistance. Once a critical mass of the population adopts the voluntary ID for convenience, example for age verification at supermarkets or quicker airport checks, so what they'll do is they'll introduce some conveniences with having this voluntary ID, right? And people will start to opt for it more and more. And then it says once it reaches a critical mass, meaning the majority of population have it, it becomes what? The de facto necessity. Eventually, businesses or services may stop accepting physical alternatives because the digital version is cheaper and faster to process, making the ID mandatory in all but name, right? Normalization to convenience. We just mentioned that. The tactic shifts the debate from civil liberties to user experience. By branding the ID as a tool to make people's lives easier, right? As noted in the 2024 King's speech regarding digital transformation and smart data bill, the government encourages people to opt in for the sake of efficiency. Once technology is normalized in everyday life, the mandatory label becomes less controversial to reintroduce later. Testing the waters bill, right, are testing the waters, trial ballooning. The previous year's monetary declaration served as a trial balloon to gauge the level of public and parliamentary pushback. After seeing the strength of the opposition, including a petition with millions of signatures and warnings from civil liberties group, the government listened, quote unquote, and adjusted. This makes the new voluntary version appear like a reasonable compromise, even if the ultimate goal of high adoption remains the same. Semantic reframing. The government has pivoted away from the term ID card, right, which has historical baggage in the UK following the scrap 2006 scheme, towards terms like digital verification services or smart data, right? So I wanted to point out something here. When I asked this follow-up question, how is this connected to ID4D initiative of the World Bank and the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations? The first response that I got from the AI chat was, roughly paraphrasing, this question or this response will go against my guidelines. Do you want to rephrase or try another question? That's what it said first. It didn't want to answer because it said that it's against its guidelines, right? And I found a way to hit retry, or to have it retry, and that's when it gave me the response. So Esau knows that people are catching up to their schemes. Even when they try to do things like this, people realize that everything is connected, right, to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals agenda, right? So it says the connection between the national ID scheme, like the UK's voluntary rollout, and the global initiatives like the World Bank's ID4D, which is ID for development, and the UN's Sustainable Development Goals is rooted in the creation of a standardized, interoperable, meaning from nation to nation can operate with the ID. So if you get an ID in the UK, it is acceptable worldwide, right? It aligns with a specific international framework, right? UN Sustainable Development Goal Target 16.9, legal identity for all, the most direct link to Sustainable Development Goal 16, specifically target 16.9, which aims to provide legal identity for all, including birth registration by 2030. The tactic: the UN views a digital identity as a fundamental human right and a prerequisite for achieving other goals like financial inclusion and healthcare access. We're going to dive into that a bit too. The connection. High income nations like the UK serve as proof of concept for these systems. By moving the UK population toward a digital identity framework, it validates the UN's global goal of making digital identity the primary way humans interact with the state and the economy, right? The World Bank ID4D role, right? It says the World Bank's ID4D initiative provides the technical and financial blueprint for countries to build digital systems. It focuses on interoperability, ensuring that ID systems in one country can eventually speak to systems in another. So they are the ones who are setting the standard, saying, okay, when you build a digital ID, this is how we need you to build it to ensure, right, that we can achieve interoperability. So an ID given in a country in Africa can work when you go to a different country like the UK or America or wherever, China, right? So Something else I wanted to talk about here. Yeah, financial inclusion and programmable economies. So this is linking now everything up. Both the UN and the World Bank emphasizes digital ID as the gateway to the digital economy. So we keep telling you that these things, the reason why we're harping on these things is not just because we like to talk about digital stuff. We're showing you that the framework is being built for the mark of the beast, which is the implantable RFID microchip. It says digital wallets. The move to voluntary digital ID is the first step towards digital wallets. These wallets are intended to hold not just identity, but also educational credentials, health records, and eventually central bank digital currencies, right? And eventually that wallet is going to be in your hand as an RFID microchip, right? So I also asked a follow-up question about the NIDS system in Jamaica. So in Jamaica, we have the National Identification System, which is pretty much parallel with what UK is trying to do. It was introduced initially as mandatory, but it was struck down, right? And then reintroduced now as voluntary. Same approach. It says the parallel you've noticed between Jamaica and the UK is a textbook example of how the strategic critique tactic is applied globally to overcome constitutional and social barriers. The Jamaican experience with the national identification system is particularly significant because it set a legal precedent for how these global frameworks must be adapted to survive democratic scrutiny. The legal defeat, right, or the hard approach. In 2017, the Jamaican government passed the National Identification and Registration Act, which made enrollment mandatory. This version included criminal penalties, fines, or prison times for failing to register. Pushback. Civil liberty groups and private citizens challenged the law, arguing it violated the right to privacy and the right to liberty. The result, in 2019, the Constitutional Court struck it down, right? Ruling that mandatory biometric data collection was unconstitutional, right? So what they did was they reintroduced it. Following the court's rejection, the government pivoted. The 2021 NIDS Act was drafted to be purely voluntarily, right? By removing the threat of jail time or fines, the government neutralized the primary legal and public opinion. While the law says it is voluntary, the implementation strategy relies on exclusionary pressure, right? As government services, banks, and even private sector transactions move towards requiring NIDS for faster verification, the choice to opt out becomes increasingly burdensome. So it's a tactic. When you straight up tell somebody something is mandatory, immediately their defenses are gonna go up. But when you use something that's subtle, like exclusionary pressure, right? Let's look at what exclusionary pressure is, right? Exclusionary pressure refers to the structural, social, or environmental forces that marginalize specific groups, restricting their access to resources, spaces, and opportunities like education or housing. It operates by creating environments where certain individuals, due to race, income, or ability, feel unwelcome or are systematically forced out, right? And where can we see that? Where where can we see that? Revelation chapter 13, verse 16. It says, He causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, that no man might buy or sell save either at the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. Right? So that's it right there. Exclusionary pressure. You can't participate in the economy, in government services without it, right? The global funding connection. Jamaica's NIDS is one of the most visible examples of the World Bank's ID40 initiative in action. The World Bank provided $68 million loan specifically to implement NIDS. So when people see things like this that's being pushed, the NIDS system in Jamaica, the JAMDEX, which is Jamaica's central bank digital currency, they look at it and they say, oh, this is Jamaican legislation, but it's not. These initiatives are coming from a global framework from the United Nations, the World Bank, and other international bodies like the Bank of International Settlements, which is the central bank of central bank, as they say. Jamaica's system was modeled after international best practices promoted by the World Bank, emphasizing a digital first economy, which is why the last one of the last lists I did, the governor of the Bank of Jamaica, he expressed disappointment and he was annoyed with the banks in Jamaica because he's saying that they're standing in the way of digitalizing the Jamaican economy because this is what's being pushed, right? So, connection to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The government argues that NIDS is the only way to leave no one behind. He literally said that. Ensuring that the most vulnerable citizens have an identity that allows them to receive social benefits. See that? Right? So they tie it directly to your benefits. By aligning with the UN's 2030 agenda, Jamaica ensures it remains eligible for international grants and favorable credit ratings. They can't fall by the wayside. Hey, the Prime Minister keeps saying, and you can hear the frustration in his voice, I'm just trying to move the country forward. Right? So, why this shift is a global pattern? What you are seeing in both the UK and Jamaica is a transition from direct compulsion to systemic necessity. Right? Phase one monitors, test the legal and social limits. If it passes, implementation is immediate. Phase two, voluntary. If phase one fails, relabel it as voluntary to remove political friction. Phase three, necessity. Build the digital ecosystem, banking, travel, health, so that the ID is required for participation in modern life. Right? This is Psalm chapter 64 and verse 5 in the NLT. They encourage themselves to do evil and plan how to set their traps in secret. Who will ever notice, they ask. As they plot their crimes, they say, we have devised the perfect plan. Yes, the human heart and mind are cunning. But what? God himself will shoot them with his arrows and suddenly striking them down. Will ruin, their own tongues will ruin them, and all that see them will shake their heads. As much as they want to prevent, their artificial intelligence from spilling the beans, it still is. Right? Job chapter 5 and verse 12. He frustrates the plans of the schemers so the work of their hands will not succeed. He traps the wise in their own cleverness so their cunning schemes are thwarted. Right? So hopefully, this lesson was edifying. Till next time, shalom.